Hi there! Welcome to the Arkham Sessions, the only podcast dedicated to the psychological analysis of every single episode of Batman the Animated Series, brought to you by Comics Alliance. My name is Dr. Andrea Letamendi, and I am joined by...
Brian Ward.
Hi there, Brian.
Hey there.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well because it's a very good week for us.
This week is essentially Batman week.
It is essentially Batman week, both officially and, in my opinion, based on the episode that we're watching, I can't imagine a better episode of the Arkham Sessions than this one right here, at least until next week. But this week is going to be an awesome week.
This episode is very psychologically relevant.
Yes.
So I would say that it's a great... Batman week is a great week to dive into this episode.
And why is it Batman week?
July 23rd has been claimed as the Batman Day.
Yeah, official Batman Day. DC Comics made it that.
It is, well, it is the 75th anniversary of Batman, the first...
Yeah.
Well, why it... But wait.
I know what you're thinking.
Yeah, so the comics didn't come out in July. So what's that about?
Yeah. The Detective Comics that introduced Batman was in May of 1939, I believe. So it would have been May-ish. To be perfectly honest, DC chose July 23rd because it's the day that opens Comic-Con. And you really got to milk all that media for all it's worth.
I'm not complaining. I think it's great.
Any opportunity to celebrate Batman is a good one for me.
Yeah.
I know that you must be extremely excited about this particular episode, as you mentioned, because it's very psychologically relevant. But it basically takes place in Arkham Asylum. Mm-hmm. That in itself, I would imagine, would get you all like super hyper and ready to go. And
this is my world.
Yeah.
Essentially, this is everything I think about, everything I talk about. Essentially, this episode is one of the episodes that led me to be interested in psychology. That is not an exaggeration.
Really?
That's the truth.
Okay, then if that's the case, let's get to it, because we are, of course, talking about Dreams in Darkness. It was written by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens. It's the first time that the writers have ever chosen to go with narration.
There was no time left. Not for me, not for him, and not for Gotham City.
Batman opens up the episode. He is in a straitjacket. Dr. Bartholomew, as he introduces himself. I'm wondering if this is the same Dr. Bartholomew as Dr. Bartholomew Wolper from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. Of course, he'd be going by like sort of a Dr. Phil type moniker, going by that first name, if that's the case.
Well, this psychiatrist, you're right, goes by Dr. Bartholomew.
Yeah.
And he doesn't look anything like the Dark Knight Returns Dr. Bartholomew.
Right.
But his personality is very similar. Sort of the kind of disregard for patient care. I wonder if it is some kind of tribute or some kind of connection.
I do definitely want to talk about his disregard for patient care. When we open up, Batman is in a straitjacket, and we reveal that he's actually been there for a while. The orderlies talk about the fact that the hallucinations are dying down, and when Dr. Bartholomew then approaches Batman, who seems very sympathetic to Batman's cause. He understands that Batman is an important character in Gotham.
Such a pity, really. To think, after all he's accomplished, that he should end up here, like this.
But when Batman then starts saying, have you gotten a hold of Gordon? Have you gotten a hold of the authorities? You then realize, or Bartholomew realizes, that the hallucinations have not died down. Batman is still going through a lot, and he says, we're just going to have to leave him in there longer.
Right. Well, and the thing is, Dr. Bartholomew actually thinks that Batman has hallucinations, has some kind of clinical disorder.
Yeah.
Whereas as the episode unfolds, we learn that Batman has been exposed to some kind of fear toxin or something that is creating the experience of hallucinations. So there's that sympathetic kind of caretaking nature that Dr. Bartholomew clearly wants to help him, but he's not really hearing what Batman is saying. Now, Batman's in his bat suit.
Yeah.
He's in a straitjacket in the bat suit. So this isn't Bruce Wayne in a cell at Arkham.
Right.
It's Batman.
Right.
So it's very interesting that Dr. Bartholomew has that level of respect toward him and, legitimately thinks that he has some kind of mental disorder and is keeping him there under observation to continue to monitor his symptoms and try to uncover, what's going on psychologically with him.
Let's talk about that. We see that Batman was trying to stop someone from tampering with the water supply of the Health Springs Spa at the pumping station, and he is exposed to a gas. Now, we find out that this, of course, was planned.
Precisely on schedule.
The first major hallucination that we saw that he was startled by Alfred in the Batcave, but the first major hallucination that we saw was as he was driving to Arkham Asylum in the Batmobile, and he suddenly thinks that Robin is in the road.
Robin!
That, of course, sends the Batmobile careening down the hill, and it crashes there at the asylum. Presumably, he then goes unconscious because we start to see a couple of orderlies sort of
Great
in silhouette
scene.
running
Love the
toward
scene.
him.
We see smoke coming out of the Batmobile,
Yeah.
and then these two figures running towards the vehicle with
Right.
the Arkham gate right
Yeah.
behind it.
Yeah, and then we see him strapped to a gurney. Bartholomew actually stops the orderly from removing Batman's cowl.
And not yet. His mask is at the root of his delusional fixation. To take it off might plunge him into a catatonic state.
Do you leave the mask on? Do you take it off? Is it true that taking it off could plunge him?
You leave it on, but for different reasons. Now, just like anybody coming in with any kind of garment or clothing or mask or accessory, you don't forcibly remove it unless, of course, you have to apply some kind of medical care that requires that.
So you really would leave? They would leave it on. That's realistic.
I wouldn't say now he's being admitted,
Yeah.
so I would say that there's no pressure in absolutely having to have that mask off.
Okay.
Over time, of course, there's no reason to have it on either because he's been in the cell. Later we see he's been in the cell for some time. So the reasoning to leave it on would simply be out of respect for the patient, out of wanting them to willingly be able to take it off themselves, out of some kind of level of respect for their identity. And if now at this point we know that this psychiatrist understands who Batman is to some degree, like if some random person with a mask came in, I wouldn't necessarily be interested in forcibly removing the mask.
Right.
I would want to understand why they're wearing it. And I would wonder if taking the mask off would create some kind of anxiety, anger. I don't know.
And in this case, he's concerned that by removing the mask, it could put him into a catatonic state.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where he gets that. I think that...
Is it because he's a psychiatrist? Really, he just wants to give him drugs? We do actually see him try to...
He does try to give him drugs.
He does try to give him drugs on a regular basis.
No, I mean, of course, it makes the episode so much better. And he can't know that he's Bruce Wayne, so it makes sense. But I think ultimately his reasoning that it would put him in a catatonic state, that doesn't really make much clinical sense to me, unless his theory about this person wearing the Batman costume, that if indeed he's in this delusional state and must be in this costume, and if the costume is removed and his delusional state is disrupted, yeah, I would agree that there would be, some kind of anxiety related, identity crisis, something that would cause distress to the person. Would it put them in a catatonic state? I don't know.
He clearly understands that Batman has been a hero for Gotham. He actually says that it's a pity that Batman has come to this.
Yeah.
But he tries to claim that the cowl is part of a delusional fixation. So that almost suggests that as the psychiatrist, he believes that Batman is not necessarily a real hero, but believes that he's a hero or believes that he's important for Gotham or something along those lines.
Right.
I don't know. Hearing those words sort of suggests to me that the Doctor doesn't think he is really a hero. And this actually reminds me of a comic book story which started out with Shadow of the Bat. And the first 4 issues of that, which I think were called The Last Arkham, involved Jeremiah Arkham, who had, of course, sort of inherited Arkham Asylum from Amadeus Arkham. And Jeremiah actually thought that Batman was messed up in the head.
Yeah, very different from Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, which is a story in which the Joker kind of pulls Batman into Arkham, trying to tap into his psychoses or neuroses.
Yeah.
And, kind of play with Batman's worst fears.
Yeah, and The Last Arkham, and this entire story reminds me a lot of The Last Arkham in that it's about Batman going into Arkham. Now, in the comic book series, he and Gordon have worked out this plan to get him committed into Arkham. It's sort of a 21 Jump Street kind of scenario where he goes in to be an inmate, but the whole time it's in order to uncover the series of really grisly, brutal murders that are believed to have been committed by Victor Zsasz. And in the process, Zsasz ends up sort of getting Jeremiah Arkham on his side, and Arkham starts to think Batman really could be messed up. And the entire thing ends in sort of the sewers and kind of this cavernous, underground, very much like this episode.
Yeah.
But I do really find myself fascinated by the way Batman is treated in this episode. Whenever they go to his door and they slide the little shutter open to see inside, Batman is always in deep darkness. Would he be treated this way in this situation? Like, what would be the reasoning for taking someone who has hallucinations, is screaming things? Oh, and by the way, I know this is sort of going off on a separate tangent, but you being a fan of this particular story of Death in the Family, might have caught when he was on the gurney and he was screaming various things. One of the things he said was,
Robin, look out. Don't do it. It's a trap. The hallucinations were getting stronger. I could have sworn I had really seen Robin in front of me, but I couldn't tell them that. I was raving, incoherent. Look out. Joker's got a bomb!
Yeah.
Now, it's weird because if he was referencing A Death in the Family, he was talking to Jason Todd, not Dick Grayson, who is the Robin. For those that don't know, Jason Todd was killed, or believed to be killed, by a bomb set by the Joker.
Yeah.
After the Joker had bludgeoned him with a crowbar. Little things like that are constantly popping up in this episode. And it's so mind-blowing. If you've not been able to see this episode, you have to if you're a Batman fan, because there's so much cool stuff in it.
And the narration, I mean, you mentioned the narration in the beginning. The narration is unlike other episodes because you have that kind of voiceover walking us through what's going on, explaining how he ended up in the cell to begin with.
Right.
Because as the episode unfolds, you realize he's really held in, like you said, in isolation in this dark cell in a straitjacket.
Yeah. So before I went off on this tangent, though, I was asking the treatment of Batman. You said that keeping the cowl on might actually be reasonable.
For a short period of time.
What about putting him in the straitjacket in a darkened cell? What would be the reasonings for this?
That makes no sense. I mean, I think realistically, if we were really talking about a psychiatric facility, we wouldn't have him in the straitjacket. We wouldn't have him in isolation in a dark cell. He would have a room. He would have a bed. He would have, unless he has demonstrated some kind of risk to himself or to someone else. So threatening to harm himself, threatening to harm other people, or just having just a really bizarre, dangerous sense of self or mental state. One might call that grave disability. We may need to have him restrained in a certain way. It's incredibly rare, though, to have somebody like that in a straitjacket. And in fact, straitjackets really aren't used, medically or psychiatrically.
What?
So
You have just disillusioned everybody.
well, I mean, we know they've been used historically.
Yeah.
But
today, straitjackets aren't really used.
No, I mean,
Only by magicians and escape
only
artists.
by magicians, right? And as we saw, like you mentioned, the straitjacket wasn't even accurately.
Well, there were a number of
depicted.
design flaws with that straitjacket. For starters, a straitjacket should have a strap going from back to front,
Yeah.
and so that you can't pull it off up over your head.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have something there, and this particular straitjacket has no strap going back to front. But it's also one of those situations where we saw him escape from a straitjacket once before in Be a Clown.
Yeah, and a tank.
Yeah, I mean, he was in Houdini's water torture chamber,
Yeah.
and still got out of that.
He should have been able to get out of this straitjacket.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
There are trick straitjackets. There are escape artists.
Oh, I see.
Some of the better, of course, the better escape artists are escaping from legit straitjackets. But there are straitjackets, and it was at a sort of carnival setting. So maybe Joker didn't have like a good one. I don't know. And maybe Batman he was impaired.
Okay, so speaking of being impaired,
Yeah.
you occasionally have facilities where they use physical restraints, but only because in a moment, in that particular time, there's imminent danger. The patient is, threatening to hurt themselves or could pose a danger to other people, and so you wouldn't just have someone sitting in a room with a straitjacket.
Okay.
And certainly, we have to remember that this is Arkham Asylum. This isn't Gotham General Hospital, where they might have a psychiatric ward, right? This is where the criminally insane, so to speak, go to, where they're incarcerated. So this is a facility for criminals.
And just a couple of weeks ago, in Fear of Victory, we saw that the Joker had a bed, Scarecrow had a rocking chair, Poison Ivy had a bed and a plant. I mean, they let them keep their costumes. They let them keep all of their accessories. They were all behind glass.
He's being treated very poorly compared to how those individuals are treated. But the doctor is interesting. He claims that it's all for Batman's sake. He says,
Right.
we need to keep you here longer. We need to understand what's going on with you. We need to keep you stable. So those are words that imply that he's in a psychiatric emergency, that he's, that he's posing a threat to himself, or that it would be dangerous to release him out, into the community, and more observation is required.
And I know that you were a big fan of this particular scene. At one point in time, Bartholomew asks him to sort of recount his story, to talk about what it is, the elaborate plan that Batman seems to think is going on. Batman, of course, thinks that someone is tampering with the water supply, and that person could only be Scarecrow, and that he was coming to check up on Scarecrow in Arkham Asylum, just as he did with Fear of Victory a couple weeks ago. But Bartholomew says he just saw Scarecrow earlier in the day. Mm-hmm. And also says,
I think this plot is just another delusion. And deep down, you believe so too. Otherwise, why come to Arkham? The one place where costumed delusional personalities can receive compassionate help.
Yeah. He's in the right place.
yeah,
Right?
he firmly believes that Batman has problems.
Well, and he sees, we know that Batman's vehicle crashed, right outside the facility. And it could be that this was seen as a voluntary hospitalization,
Right.
almost. Like, we knew you were coming here to admit yourself, and you went into an episode and you crashed,
So now you're being involuntarily held? Or?
This is involuntary hospitalization at this point, because Batman has made it clear that he doesn't want to be there. But I could see the psychiatrist reasoning that, he was on his way here to be admitted, and it's in our better clinical judgment to keep him here,
Right.
because we want to keep him safe and we want to ensure that he gets psychiatric care, because he is paranoid. He's talking about the entire city being overtaken by some kind of toxin, some
Right.
kind of gas. He's uttering, he's making all these comments about the Joker and bombs and, all these different people. And it does, even as we're experiencing this episode, we hear these things and it does sound kind of out there. He's sounding a bit crazy, and we would probably react the same way.
Right. So talk about talk about in the real world, a patient coming in like this, and this is the real world.
This is the real world.
Well, talk about that. Talk about what it would be like for Batman, for someone who comes in, even a decorated vigilante such as Batman. Talk about this involuntary hold, for one. What causes an involuntary hold? How long can you keep a guy like Batman in a cell legally for observation, and for what purposes, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Well, all states have laws that permit involuntary psychiatric holds or psychiatric hospitalizations. So the one I'm referring to is specific to California because this is where I practice. Mm-hmm. But overall, with some small, differences, all states allow what we call non-criminal holds. Okay. Meaning the hold is specific to commitment of mentally ill persons. So people with impairments of judgment, impairments of reality testing, folks, again, that I said before, pose a threat to either themselves or to other people.
Okay.
You may have heard of something called 5150.
Yes. Lindsay Lohan and Amanda Bynes were on a 5150.
Exactly. So 5150 refers to a section of the California law referring to psychiatric holds. So while someone is under 5150, they're essentially required to get evaluation and treatment, at some kind of mental health facility, and they're basically held in custody for a period of up to 72 hours. Mm-hmm. That's been seen as enough time to stabilize a patient, to undergo evaluation, to make a determination about potential diagnoses, to contact support. That takes a few days.
Well, what is the evaluation process? What would go into making that assessment?
I think what Dr. Bartholomew is doing isn't completely uncommon. He's trying to assess for, Batman's state of mind, mm-hmm. and understanding if he's cognizant, aware of where he is, who he is. So you have to kind of establish cognitive abilities. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen folks, in movies or TV series, they'll be asked to draw something, or they'll be asked to repeat 3 words or remember 3 words. They'll be asked to say who the president is, like all these very important mm-hmm. questions. You and I can answer them, pretty easily. But those types of mental state assessments are to understand if someone is, is either distressed or has certain impairments that are considered, cognitive, psychiatric, emotional, those things. So again, that may take a couple of days to understand exactly what it is someone is going through and experiencing. Dr. Bartholomew is trying to understand the nature of Batman's hallucinations. And essentially, he's trying to really understand Batman's insight as well. Last week, we talked about insight. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So remember how the Mad Hatter has moments where he actually believes he's the Mad Hatter?
Right.
And his secretary is actually Alice.
Right.
And, his boss is the Queen of Hearts. Like, he is completely immersed in this delusional world.
Okay.
And we talked about how level of insight is, referring to his ability to understand that these are delusions. So it's almost like your ability to know about your disability,
okay,
so to speak. So I've worked with patients who have schizophrenia, for instance, and they would be able to tell me, right now I'm seeing something, or right now I'm hearing something, and I know this is because of my illness. And I would ask, do you believe that this voice is really, a person talking to you? Or do you believe that there really are people in that painting trying to communicate with you? And someone with very good insight would say, no, I understand that's a product of my brain. I understand that's my illness. Someone with very poor insight would believe it. They would be absolutely convinced that those things are actually happening to him or them. So Dr. Bartholomew is also getting at insight. I think he's established that these are delusions, these are hallucinations, that there is some break from reality. And Batman he wouldn't be held there.
Is he delusional? Like, is he actually having delusions? Because it seems like he's having a lot of hallucinations.
Yeah.
But everything he is saying to Bartholomew is correct.
Right. Dr. Bartholomew is questioning whether those experiences are actually real. He thinks that Batman has this delusion that, the Scarecrow has escaped from Arkham, that he's, going to, use this toxin to make everybody in Gotham City go crazy. I mean, it really does sound very outlandish. And I think by now, anytime Batman says, hey, this huge thing is going to go down, I would believe it. But this doctor is seeing this as a delusion. And it actually sounds very paranoid. So you've heard of paranoid schizophrenia. There's a category called paranoid delusions for a reason. Many folks who experience schizophrenia have those types of delusions. Thoughts that people are after you, or that the government's going to get you, or that, there's this big conspiracy, those types of paranoid symptoms. When you've got someone presenting with these paranoid symptoms, rapid speech, these comments about all these different characters and people that are coming out to get him, having just crashed his car, like all of these, having seen Robin in the middle of the street, like all of these things they don't look good. I think the psychiatrist has good reason to keep him there. But we don't need him in the straitjacket. We don't even need him in a dark room. That part of this story is a bit extreme.
So let's talk about some of Batman's hallucinations. This episode does a fantastic job of showing some just nightmarish visions and images. At one point, we see that Batman is walking through the door of his cell into a very kind of hellish-looking version of Crime Alley. It's got the orange hue to it. It seems sort of hot, and then becomes Crime Alley, where he sees Thomas and Martha Wayne, and they begin walking toward a tunnel, and Batman is running, but running in slow motion. He can never catch up to them, and he is being held back. And they walk into the tunnel, and suddenly the world around him sort of crumbles, and we see a beautiful image of the tunnel actually having this sort of lava-like red stuff coming out of it, and we start to notice that the tunnel is becoming the barrel of a gun. And one could say that lava-ish, that hot red liquid could have been the blood of the Waynes pouring out, as we know that Thomas and Martha were shot to death in Crime Alley. The gun cocks back and it fires, and we see that Batman then wakes up in this burst of light, and Bartholomew and his two orderlies are once again observing this, and basically I'm happy that Batman, who wakes up in the fetal position in his cell, didn't go and say something like, "Mom, Dad, Thomas and Martha Wayne, it's your son, little Bruce." Like, I'm glad that he didn't go spouting off, family secrets like that while they're observing.
Oh, I see. Yes, that would have been bad.
Yeah, but
also, now I'm just realizing, does this chart just say Batman?
Yeah, apparently it's just Batman. And there's no history.
What about an emergency contact? Who are they gonna? All of this it's just interesting patient care.
Yeah. And so it's one of those situations where I think this episode handles these hallucinations wonderfully, because we as the audience are equally terrified by what we see, or at least distraught by what we see.
Yeah, it's really well done. And I think, as we see, especially that scene, and how he reacts to it, we realize that he truly believes he's in the experience, which they don't make it clear whether they're nightmares or whether they're hallucinations, because you can have nightmares that are very vivid,
Okay.
and you can wake up from them. You can have hallucinations that are very vivid, and you believe that you're in that situation. Typically, hallucinations, whether they're auditory or visual, take place within your environment. So, someone would be sitting in a room and they'd be hearing additional voices of people not in that room, or they would see figures, persons, or things in the room.
So when Batman starts out in his own cell and walks out of it, the cell part could actually be pretty accurate.
Right. The rest of that, while he's walking through Crime Alley and seeing his parents, that looks more like a nightmare.
Okay.
Rather
Very well
than,
could be.
Rather than hallucination. And you're right. When we see him in his cell, it's possible he wakes up from this.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, it's very disturbing. He was living that as if he was, it was basically a very vivid nightmare or flashback or hallucination. It's unclear. And he's in such distress that he's just curled up on the floor in a little ball. And it's gripping. It's a really moving moment.
That's when Bartholomew and his two orderlies come in to admit that they may have been wrong, that the Scarecrow has in fact escaped from Arkham Asylum. And that's when Batman says that he needs to find him. He needs to find where the Arkham water supply is coming from. And Bartholomew tells him that comes from the Arkham caverns below the asylum. And Batman insists on going to find the Scarecrow. However,
well, the only way to get there, of course, is to descend these steep, dark, stairs into
Mines of Moria kind of staircase leading down into the caverns. But Bartholomew won't let him.
In your condition, I can't allow that. You're staying here.
On the one hand, Dr. Bartholomew is accurate in saying you're in no state to leave the facility, and especially no state to get into some kind of life-threatening battle with this villain.
Yeah.
With a very dangerous person. So I would agree that that's not something that I would do. On the other hand, where's the realization that Batman was correct, that the city is in peril, that there's this huge risk? And I would see that Batman may be the only person who can truly protect everybody.
Well, he does say let the police handle this.
Yeah.
He admits that Batman was right, but he says let the police take care of it. You need rest. You need to heal from,
Well, and he's actually right, because now the doctor knows that Batman was telling the truth, meaning he was exposed to this fear-inducing hallucination, creating toxin. So to keep him there and to understand that he's still, under the effects of this toxin, again, it makes sense.
Yeah. We find out after this scene that in a scene that reminds me very much of Batman Begins, that the grand scheme of the Scarecrows is to contaminate Gotham City's water supply with this fear toxin that will induce mass hysteria. And he's not doing it for revenge like he was last time. He's not doing it out of this need to just kind of watch Gotham go into madness. He has almost gone back into his state of experimentation and observation as a scientist, because he actually says
The opportunities to study the nature of fear will be unparalleled. It's time for the greatest controlled experiment in mass madness to finally begin.
they flip a switch and the countdown goes to 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Now, why you need a countdown to inject the toxin into the water
Okay,
supply,
look,
I don't know.
It's
but
an experiment.
It's-
It has to be measured.
Yeah,
It has
apparently.
to be standardized. You started at 5 minutes. You flip the switch. It makes sense to me.
But now you've got the Scarecrow going into experimentation mode. Again, all he wants to do is observe
Yeah.
this mass madness. And, he's maybe, I'm not allowed to say it necessarily, but it seems to me he's sort of crazy for wanting to do it, but he's got science on his brain. He wants
He's
to see what it's
curious.
like when an entire city goes mad with fear.
Yeah, he's back to his sciencey. It's like he's that curious
Yeah.
scientist again, and he wants to better explain and understand the fear reaction. What's interesting is when we learn more about Batman's exposure to the toxin, we again, this is kind of in the telling when he tells his story in the hospital. We learn that he had visited the man who was first exposed to the toxin.
Right.
That man had been taken to the hospital. He was under observation in a medical facility. And Batman is there shortly after being exposed himself and opens the chart and finds that the chart said
He was hallucinating wildly due to a massive fear reaction in the amygdala of his brain.
Okay, so that sounds like a bunch of science-y, YNC sort of stuff, bunch of big words I don't necessarily understand. Is this the case of writers doing research, or is this the case of writers creating scenarios that kids won't understand?
it's actually quite true.
Really?
No, the amygdala is a real part of the brain.
Sure.
And it's one of the components of the brain that is responsible for fear management. So it actually makes a lot of sense. But there are some more recent, now this is in the 90s, right?
Okay, yeah.
There's more recent research from the early 2000s that shows a link between schizophrenia and areas of the brain, including the amygdala. So
Schizophrenia, of course, one of the chief symptoms you said being hallucinations.
Right. I said schizophrenia. Of course, no one has mentioned that in this episode of BTAS, but hallucinations are a core component of schizophrenia. So interestingly, there's been some research, again, in the last 15 years or so, that has linked the area of the brain. Actually, it's called the HAC, hippocampal amygdala complex.
Okay.
And that part of the brain has been linked to the pathophysiology of schizophrenia and suggests an association between that structure and hallucinations.
So my mind has just been blown. Are you suggesting, and you've all heard it here first, folks, if this is actually what Dr. Letamendi is suggesting, are you suggesting that the Scarecrow is using his fear toxin to induce schizophrenia?
Yeah, essentially that's what he's doing.
Wow. So it's not just random hallucinations, like he is actually...
Yes, specifically hallucinations related to fear and paranoia. And again, those paranoid symptoms could be a component or a symptom of schizophrenia.
Wow.
So, want me to blow your mind again?
Yes.
I will. With this research from the American Journal of Psychiatry, which found that there is a connection between paranoid cognition and the amygdala.
Meaning what?
Meaning, not only are there neuroimaging and brain studies showing a connection between the amygdala, as Batman mentioned in this episode, and schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. There's a connection between this part of the brain and paranoid symptoms of schizophrenia. So again, to put in plain non-Vulcan English, the part of the brain that Batman mentions is associated with those paranoid types of symptoms, those fears. So
Jonathan Crane
cool.
might actually be onto something. He might be studying the links. By imprisoning him, you may have prevented, because like you said, in 1993, he was working on this research, and it wasn't until the early 2000s that anyone started publishing studies. It could have been that 10 years earlier, Jonathan Crane could have been like, see, I told you, there were links to the amygdala and paranoid schizophrenia. But
he was right all along. Yeah, he's pretty much a genius.
I think so too. You know why? Because he's ginger.
So I will put the studies up on our site so that folks can...
Yeah, because I definitely want to read more about that. If you're interested in reading it, you should definitely check it out. The links are below. Of course, Batman ends up escaping from Arkham Asylum, as you would expect him to. He uses an axe to cut off the straitjacket. I'm not sure how he got the axe off of the hook to begin with. He may have kicked it and then, pushed it along with his foot or something, but he certainly didn't pick it up. And then he positioned it and he used it to cut the straitjacket off. And then something that I thought was weird, you've got a cape that, has been used to go through fire. In some stories, bullets have had a hard time sort of piercing. In some cases, they say that it's like a Kevlar type material. And yet, Arkham Asylum is shooting darts at him, sedative darts. One dart rips straight through the cape and goes into another guard, knocking that guard out. That's a very flimsy cape tonight. It's got a little, or it hit the sweet spot. It hit the one spot of the cape that wasn't coated in some sort of Teflon.
Maybe that's a special Arkham Asylum cape, only used for when he's held captive in Arkham Asylum.
I don't know that I would use that cape because now you realize it doesn't actually stop anything. He goes down into the caverns and ends up having more hallucinations.
The best ever.
More nightmarish. He sees a rat turn into the Joker. He sees a giant version of the Penguin come up out of the ground.
With a tiny little umbrella.
And he's beating the top of the cave, sort of caving things in. And probably the creepiest moment of the hallucination is the Penguin's head splitting apart and Two-Face coming out of it.
Yeah. He's
flipping the coin, and then he ends up throwing the coin, and it turns into like a razor, like a saw blade sort of thing coming after Batman.
It is really one of the most disturbing.
Absolutely. Two-Face then melts and becomes Poison Ivy.
Which doesn't make sense because I thought he would melt and become...
Maybe Clayface or something like that. Yeah, but melts and becomes Poison Ivy. Then from behind Poison Ivy, we see Robin and Alfred come along, and they refuse to help Batman.
It's too late for that, Bruce. You've lived in darkness too long.
Yes, do come along, Master Bruce. It's time to go home.
And then Batman falls through the cavernous abyss and ends up going into the Scarecrow's mouth. And Scarecrow says that the great Batman's scared out of his mind. How does it feel? Batman only wakens when a bat actually flies overhead, and
a real bat.
Yeah. And he sort of comes back to long enough to end up fighting guards and stopping the Scarecrow from launching his toxin into the water supply, which is a weird sort of fight because, like I said before, it's a big machine. And there's a countdown. It started at 5 minutes. By the time Batman gets to it and sort of stops it, he stops it at 1:45.
Fool! Did you really think I wouldn't have backup controls?
Scarecrow sort of had everything in mind here. He thought, there's a strong possibility that Batman's going to come down here and he's going to flip the switch.
You got to have the backup, and the backup is just below.
Drops down a level.
Near the first plan A.
Yeah, it opens up a panel, flips the switch. Now the timer magically goes from 1:45 to 14 seconds. Apparently,
it's in cartoon time.
Yeah, it is in cartoon time. And Batman, of course, has to conquer his own fear in order to stop the countdown. That countdown is stopped. The machine is broken, and it actually causes a great explosion, which sort of collapses the cavern around them. And it's a fun scene. And like I said, it does remind me of one of those battles with Victor Zsasz in the last Arkham. And earlier on, Batman was offered an antidote. He was told that he would actually have to go to sleep for 2 days for the antidote to fully work. And
Nope.
Batman
Not gonna happen.
can't let that happen.
No.
Glad it didn't, because within those 2 days, even going mad, he was able to stop the Scarecrow. But Alfred administers the antidote. One could think that this is all par for the course, but I find it a particularly deep insight into Bruce Wayne and Batman, in that the doctor that tells him, you've got this problem and I've got an antidote and I could give it to you, is not necessarily trusted enough to be the person to administer it later. Instead, it happens in the Batcave, and Alfred is the one who does it. And Bruce actually says,
Thanks, Alfred. It's good to know I'm safe here.
So in this area is where he is most comfortable, and through Alfred is where he would rather get the antidote.
I really like that scene because we see Bruce, finally receiving his treatment, safely in his, what we would consider kind of the Batcave version of a hospital bed.
Yeah.
And, but what's interesting is he says, it's good to know I'm safe here. Alfred walks away, goes up the elevator, and it pans out to show that Bruce is alone in the Batcave, in the darkness.
In a bed, just sort
In a
of,
bed,
yeah.
with bats kind of flying around.
One bat lands on a perch, and the entire scene is sort of engulfed in the shadow of a bat, which, by the way, I think is probably their little homage to Batman's Shadow of the Bat, which is where
nice.
The last Arkham is the first 4 issues. So maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed a little on the nose. So
I can't shake the parallel between this story and a rather popular, very well-known study called On Being Sane in Insane Places. Tell me you've heard of the study before.
not only have I heard it, I've never heard of it.
You've probably read, did you take Psych 101?
I did.
It's one of those research studies, back in the early 70s, late 60s, that is, read about for decades and decades. So
Okay, I don't know that I heard it. I don't know that I was introduced to it through that title. What was the title of it again?
The title is On Being Sane in Insane Places. That is the name of the research article.
I don't know.
That's how
Yeah.
awesome psychology was decades ago. It's now called the Rosenhan experiment. The Rosenhan experiment was, as I said, a very famous, well-known experiment that was done in the late 60s, early 70s to essentially kind of prove a point that psychiatrists really don't know sane from insane. That basically
Do tell. I want to hear about this.
it was run by Dr. David Rosenhan, who was a psychologist.
Oh, of course it was, because it's the whole like psychologists versus psychiatrists sort of that, like, oh, psychiatrists don't know what they're doing. You should come to us. We're the psychologists.
Now you laugh, but it kind of was true that
Wow.
he felt as though there wasn't a really sophisticated diagnostic system that was reliable, that was standardized. Now we did have at that time the DSM, which I refer to, the diagnostic.
Your big book.
Yes, our big book of mental disorders.
Your tome.
Now that manual has gone through several revisions since then, but you're actually pretty accurate that there was this accusation that the psychiatry field wasn't, providing good practice, wasn't providing appropriate mental health care.
So when people, for people who don't know the difference, because I don't know that we've ever necessarily discussed this before, the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people understand that a psychiatrist is an MD
Yeah.
who prescribes medication, but a psychologist is a PhD. You don't prescribe medications.
No.
But a lot of times people think that psychiatrists are the ones that you spend a full hour with sitting on a couch, talking about your mother. But really, that's more of a psychologist's Like, what is the difference
Well,
there?
it really depends on the care, because psychiatrists and psychologists can provide what we call like talk therapy
Yeah.
or psychotherapy, and that may include up to an hour or more of sitting in an office talking to a psychiatrist or psychologist. A psychiatrist can administer medication,
Mm-hmm.
and typically if you receive medication, you also need to talk a little bit about how that's going.
Right.
You know, are there side effects? Am I getting better? Am I getting worse? How am I feeling?
But a typical session for a psychiatrist will
Typically not a full hour, because their role is essentially to provide the psychiatric medication and to do brief evaluations, to get updates, and they have training in psychotherapy, but that's traditionally that's not their main role.
It is really like a medical doctor. You go in, they say, how is that medication working for you? You tell them it's working well or not. They up the dose or lower the dose or change the medication or whatever, and then
Sure.
send you on your way.
Sure. That's not to say that they can't or won't provide
Right.
more psychotherapy, but I don't know that many choose to, because they're able to see more patients and provide more care to more patients. If they can.
Churn you out.
Well, I don't. That's really not.
It's insensitive.
That's really not the efforts. The efforts
Right.
are to provide psychiatric care, medication management, and referral, really, to
Yeah.
a clinical psychologist or to a master's level therapist to provide more of the psychosocial interventions, which I would recommend. You should have an hour or more a week, sometimes something that's more intensive to really handle everything that's going on. So 20 minutes a month? Really? That may not be enough.
Yeah.
And for other folks, 20 minutes a month getting their medication is perfectly fine. So there's a lot of variables that affect whether you see a psychiatrist or psychologist, and how long you might see them, and how many times per month you might see them.
But if you wanted to start like a little turf war, you would start an experiment
Yes,
that said that psychiatrists didn't know what they were doing.
especially in the 60s,
And
where
then what-
things were just,
And then
crazy.
how would that end up going?
Well, okay, so back to Dr. Rosenham. He decided that he was going to send what he called pseudo-patients, which were what he considered fairly psychologically healthy individuals who...
So they were plants.
They were plants, right.
He was like, it's like
Yes.
a sting operation.
Yes, he sent 3 women and 5 men to pretend as if they had auditory hallucinations, in order to gain admission to psychiatric hospitals across the country. So it turned out that these folks who were otherwise healthy lied. They were hearing things, and that they thought something was going on with them, in their brain. So they kind of had the same script, several similar things to say. And
Wouldn't that be great if they were actually hearing the same things? Like they were like, oh my God, I just had a patient earlier that said that they needed to pick up more bread
no.
too.
Think Dr. Crane. Think big, right? So he sent them to different facilities across the U.S., not the same facility. So they were all admitted, and they were all diagnosed with psychiatric disorders. After admission, as per the protocol of this experiment, they then informed staff and psychiatrists that they no longer heard the voices, and they essentially stopped having the symptoms. However, despite looking as if they'd been in remission, like they'd gotten better, they were not released. They were held, and actually on average, they were held up to 20 days.
What?
One I think stayed a week, and the longest stay was up to 2 months.
Wow.
In a facility. So what's interesting is that they were then treated as if they had, once they were labeled with their diagnosis, and most of the diagnoses they were given were psychotic in nature. So schizophrenia was like one of the most common things they were given, naturally, because they were presenting with supposed hallucinations. They were sort of monitored in a way that continued to pathologize them. So naturally, because they're in a study and they're kind of like taking notes, one particular participant mentioned that as he was taking notes and jotting down some things, a staff member of the unit was, sort of perceiving that as one of his symptoms, that he was, in a frenzy, that he was in his psychotic episode, being paranoid and jotting things down. So
Right.
what we might consider normal behavior was seen as pathological because they were in this role. They were under this label
Gotcha.
of having a mental disorder.
Wow.
One of the findings from the study is that experience
Yeah.
of being pathologized and almost characterizing that expectation, characterizing that role. Now, we talked before about the Stanford prison experiment where people, really played out their role. This was one of those situations too, where because they were perceived and treated and really dehumanized, some of these participants began to wonder if they really were insane. And they use that word in the article. That's why I'm using the word sane and insane.
Sure. So they really started to buy into it. They started to think that maybe there was a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, when this study was published in the Journal of Science, it criticized the reliability of psychiatric care and specifically the psychiatric diagnostic system. It claimed that mental health care was disempowering and demeaning to patients, and it just created this huge explosion and attention to mental health care. It really, again, it was a groundbreaking study.
So we can say that definitively correct, I hope. Things have changed since then.
Absolutely. The DSM has undergone several iterations and it relies more on science-based work, really to better capture and characterize mental health diagnoses. We're also moving toward, this has been happening for a longer period of time, and I would credit this study for pushing us in this direction, to move away from labels and creating care so specific to those labels, just like in inpatient psychiatric facilities, which is what we've been talking about. Outpatient mental health or community mental health, we still use diagnostic categories, but we really, really pay attention to the presenting symptoms, the behaviors that need attention. We aren't simply just working from diagnoses because we know they're not as reliable as really understanding and seeing the person in front of you and what they're telling you they're distressed about. So I wonder if this episode is some kind of commentary on mental health care, because you mentioned the reference to Dr. Bartholomew.
Mm-hmm.
We see Batman kind of being a bit, I wouldn't say abused, but somewhat, he's held there against his will. He's dehumanized.
And as this animated series has sort of played out, just like in the Tim Burton films, we don't exactly know what time period this animated series is in our timeline. So it is possible that maybe this was done pre-60s, where people may have been treated a little differently or something like that.
Yeah, that it may have been referencing a period of time where patient care was not respectful toward patients, and I think I can't help but think about that parallel and think about how, as many times as Batman was saying, you have to listen to me, we're in danger, I'm not crazy, essentially, he was being silenced. There's even one point where Batman gets defensive and says,
I hope I'm not disturbing you.
Isn't that why I'm here? Because I'm disturbed.
And he's trying to assert his sense of his identity and his sense of the sense of justice, essentially, that I'm trying to say something and I'm not being heard. At the end of the episode, when Batman tells Alfred that he finally feels safe, and it's a strange scene, at least for me to watch, because again, he's in this cold, dark cave by himself. It's kind of like saying I'm sane in an insane place. I mean, that's really what I was reminded of on being sane in an insane place.
Wow. You know what I got from this episode?
What?
Jonathan Crane, Ginger. One of the orderlies Ginger. But I'm not going to hold that against him. He was just doing his job. Poison Ivy, Ginger. Mm-hmm. Even though she was just a hallucination. Mm-hmm. But forget all those. I'm going to let those go.
Okay.
The real crime against Gingers, whatever the sedative is that Bartholomew puts in the syringe and is about to inject Batman with in order to shut him down, it's orange. I've never seen any kind of medication like this so brightly carrot orange.
Oh, really?
It's orange.
Is it like Fanta?
It's just like Fanta. It is like their hatred for Gingers goes so far as even the serum to shut Batman down is orange.
I don't know. I didn't notice this.
You wouldn't. You know why? You're not a Ginger.
I'm sorry.
So what I got from this episode?
Yes.
Psychiatry, bad. They hate Gingers. Although they sometimes employ one to be their muscle.
I disagree. Well, we always disagree on a few things, but I think this was meant to raise awareness about the treatment of folks with mental health problems and that we should absolutely listen
I'll
to
give you that.
what's being said. I know. It's maybe a little too deep.
I'll let you have that one. So this week, we actually went to you, the listeners, and asked for your questions. And we ended up getting a really good one emailed to us from Scott McClellan. He says, "Dear the Arkham Sessions," this is a question. This question is really directed toward Dr. Letamendi. I'm curious about your thoughts of Dr. Bartholomew's approach in this episode as a mental health care professional. Did he act in the most professional manner? We sort of discussed that. In some ways he did, and in some ways he didn't. But were his actions in the best interests of the patient? We think that it could have been until he found out. It seemed odd to me about his keeping Batman in the dark while he was locked up in his cell. We kind of touched on that as well. This is the part that I think is the really good part of his question. And that Dr. Bartholomew did not consult other professionals on this case, especially when Batman seemed lucid enough to specifically mention Commissioner Gordon or Dr. Wu, the woman who offered to administer the antidote before.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts as a mental health care professional yourself? Now, it's true. He said, did you reach out to Dr. Wu? Did you reach out to Commissioner Gordon? Mm-hmm. And Bartholomew didn't. He had said, no, I'm going to kind of ignore all of this.
Yeah.
I know you're a vigilante. I know that you've been right in the past. I'm not going to consult with the people who could validate your concerns.
Mm-hmm. That's not good. You know, if you're aware that a patient has recently been seen at the local medical care facility, it has had involvement with police enforcement. I mean, you would want all of this information. It doesn't make sense that he wouldn't access those folks and have consultation with them. And Dr. Wu would have just been able to explain this immediately, that he was exposed to this toxin. She has the antidote. She can give it to Dr. Bartholomew, and we'd be done with this.
Yeah.
But he chose not to do that, and we wouldn't consider it. We would consider it poor practice. I don't know that it would be. I mean, it certainly is bordering unethical because he's been told, look, I've seen these other practitioners. You really need to talk to them. And so it's in everyone's best interest that he does. And Dr. Bartholomew dropped the ball there. The other thing I noticed is that Dr. Bartholomew appears to specialize in costumed, delusional personality disorders or whatever he calls them.
Absolutely.
So I think he thinks he's like, the expert in handling folks that admit that are encountered at Arkham Asylum and happen to be wearing a costume. So he may feel like, well, this is my wheelhouse, and I know exactly how to handle this. And this guy's going to be here along with the Joker and Poison Ivy and these other folks.
I'm going to blame Dr. Bartholomew for all of the problems of Arkham Asylum because, as we've have established in this particular episode. Because if you remember during Fear of Victory, I questioned why someone would allow the Scarecrow to keep his costume, why someone would allow Poison Ivy to have a plant, why someone would allow Harvey to have his coin, or the Joker to have his playing cards.
Yeah.
And as we've established in this episode, Dr. Bartholomew allows Batman to keep the cowl and his costume, just as all the other arch villains, they were all allowed to keep their costumes. None of them are in traditional prison garb like we see Joker in at the beginning of Christmas with the Joker. He's in the jumpsuit and all that. And he is convinced that no one can escape, despite the fact that in every episode, someone has escaped from either Arkham Asylum. I mean, just 2 weeks ago in Fear of Victory, Scarecrow escaped.
Yeah.
And nearly took out an entire football stadium full of people, and now he does it again. Bartholomew really, I think, is the problem here.
Yeah.
He specializes in costumed delusional personalities. However,
maybe he kind of allows them to escape to preserve their delusional identity. Like, it's very important for them to enact these crimes.
You know what? I think Dr. Bartholomew may be just as delusional as his delusional costumed personalities.
I think that's accurate.
Scott, you were actually going to get a prize.
Woohoo!
Yay! Courtesy of Warner Brothers Tours, who handle the fantastic VIP tours over at Warner Brothers Studios here in Hollywood, California. Burbank, beautiful downtown Burbank. You are going to get a copy of DC Comics Batman #1 from Scott Snyder, Greg Capullo. It's the first issue that introduces the new 52. This was an issue done a couple of years ago. And you might think you have this copy, but unless you've been to Warner Brothers Studios, you do not have this copy.
No.
Why
you
is
do
that,
not.
Drea?
This is an exclusive. It's a special edition. I look at it like a Warner Brothers variant cover.
Yeah, it's totally a Warner Brothers variant cover. It actually says Warner Brothers Studios VIP Studio Tour presents the Batman exhibit, Batman 75. It's got the logo there in the corner.
You can only get this variant if you are. You can't even get it if you're just visiting. You have to be.
You have to be on the VIP Studio Tour.
Yep.
Yeah. So you have got a copy of this comic, and congratulations. And you guys should also stay tuned and submit your questions for future episodes, because there could be other prizes lined up for you guys.
We are at Comic-Con this week, so.
We are going to Comic-Con. Swag City. And that could mean prizes for you. So be sure to watch ahead and then submit your questions to us via Twitter. We are at Arkham Sessions. You can also send us emails like Scott did at arkhamsessions@gmail.com. You can also email Drea at underthemaskonline.com. Drea, where can people find you on Twitter?
They can find me on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc.
And I'm at bward028. I think that about wraps everything up, don't you?
No, not at all.
Oh.
You, my friend, have a new podcast, and the first episode has just been released. So tell us a little bit about that.
That's true. I do have a new podcast. It's called Comics Assembled. And I am doing a podcast with comic creator, illustrator, writer Tom Zoller. You might know him from Love and Capes, or you might know him from the My Little Pony micro-series comics from IDW. He is a great friend. A wonderful storyteller. He has been a writer, a letterer, an illustrator in the comics industry for quite some time. We talk about everything. Occasionally we might hit on comic news, but really the podcast itself is about the comics industry from the perspective of a comics professional. So if you're interested in comics, if you're interested in what it's like to be a comics pro, whether it's going to conventions, or where you come up with stories to write, or getting a franchised gig, or illustrating, this is the podcast for you. You can find it over at 5by5.tv and look up Comics Assembled.
fun.
Yeah, I'm very excited. It should be, roughly once a week or so. And then this can't all be about me. You've got like some sort of article that was just published.
Yes. So, as if folks can't get enough of the psychological analysis of Batman, I was interviewed by Boing Boing along with Jim Lee and Dr. Will Brooker about basically the endurance and resiliency of Batman over the last 75 years.
He has been at it for a long time.
He has. You'd think he would figure it
Have
out.
cleaned up Gotham by now. Oh, I see you're coming over to my side.
No,
It's a great article, and you should absolutely check it out over at boingboing.com.
Yeah, I'll set up the link. Folks can find it.
Link will be right below. So check that out. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't discuss the fact that this week is Comic-Con week. I know we gave you our schedule last week, but go and check out underthemaskonline.com. You will find Drea's schedule. She is on 5, count them, 5 panels at Comic-Con this week. So go check that out, underthemaskonline.com. Find her, and I'm on 2. You won't find mine on underthemaskonline.com.
No, but you are in the schedule, so folks can find you very easily.
Absolutely. Friday night, 7 o'clock, 23 ABC. It's pretty easy. Shout Factory, Scream Factory, Shout Kids panel. And then I will be moderating your Psychology of Star Trek versus Star Wars. That is Saturday night, 8:30 p.m.
Comic-Con after hours.
After hours, after dark. It's where all the magic happens.
Yeah.
So come find us.
It'll be a fun week. If you come by, please say hello. I'd love to chat with folks about the show. Once again, thanks to Comics Alliance for presenting our podcast on their site. Of course, I'm sure that they would love to hear your thoughts on
We
how
love
much
to hear it. They love to hear it. Everybody loves to hear comments. As long as they're good. Keep them good. If you got nothing nice to say, don't say anything
Zip
else.
it.
I like comments, good or bad. It means people are listening.
That's true.
So anyway, until next week, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
The Arkham Sessions.